Right. Welcome everyone. I'm not sure how many we've got on, but hopefully there's a few of you. So Phil and myself are going to go through the second part of this bike speed talk. Obviously, I delivered the first one maybe a month or a little bit more ago now. While we're doing it, obviously, if you do want to ask any questions as they come to mind, if you open the chat box and you can type them in there, and then we'll either whoever's not presenting at that time can maybe answer it via text, or we'll come back to them at the end. But if you want to sort of write them down as they come to you, by all means do that. And then once we get through the whole talk, if you want to hang on and ask some questions as people are dropping off the call, we can certainly do that as well. So yeah, so let's get on with part two. So in part one, we talked mainly about the integration of the bike and the rider. So we talked a lot about how man and machine work together. And although you put the effort to put power into the pedals, there are various forces that will try their very best to slow you down. And some of those are obviously weight or gravity. You've got aero drag, rolling resistance, and friction of the drivetrain components. And so that's where we spent most of the time talking about how we can reduce the effect of all those different things by being mindful about our setup and by having a bike fit and all those sorts of things. So we've covered those. And what we're going to move on to today is probably the more sort of obvious things, really. You know, what we can do in training and how training prepares us to ride a fast bike leg. We'll look at course management and how to plan for your race. Now, you might not plan to this detail that we're going to go into tonight for every single race that you do, but certainly if you've got one or two key races in the year that you've highlighted in your calendar, then we'll certainly want to look at this sort of depth of detail to really get the best out of that bike segment on that course. We'll consider pacing and cadence and how we should be looking maybe to alter these based on the race and the profile of the course, perhaps. We'll look at the data that's on your Garmin, maybe what you should and shouldn't be looking at and how to use that to help you get your best bike split again. And then looking at, you know, the effect of drafting and pace lines and how to avoid some pitfalls here and perhaps use them to your advantage while staying within the rules. And then we'll finish with a little basic on nutritional considerations, but we're not going to talk in any depth about diet and different sports products as such, but we'll mention how it can affect the bike leg. So I'll start off with this first little bit where I just want to go over some of the main sort of training considerations that will come up as you build for a key race. Now, we know that we need to lay a base, but base building or base training, as we think of it, could mean different things to different people. Ultimately, what we're doing is an aerobic sport, whether it's a sprint distance right through to a long distance race. It's all vastly based on your aerobic metabolism. So we need a base of aerobic fitness before we try to specialize and try to tweak that into a specific area. Now, for shorter distance racing, that might be a very traditional base period where you're doing lots of high volume, lots of slow or low intensity sort of training, because as you aim to peak, you're going to then lay on the harder, more intense intervals. And that's kind of seen as a typical model of base training and then peaking for a race. But for the guys doing middle and longer distance, your race intensity is quite low. And therefore, if you did a lot of traditional base training in the winter, you might well find that that's all you end up doing. And that's where a lot of people fall into a trap, I think, when they follow online programs and other things, is that they just often train sort of low intensity in zone 2. So what you'll find, particularly with us at TTT, is that we try to maintain all energy systems, you know, so most of the year your training might include a few sprints. It might include some zone 2 work. It might include some tempo work. It might include threshold and obviously VO2 max. And so although we will tinker with it so that we try to make it appropriate for the time of season, for your own physiology as an athlete, and then building towards your goal race, we don't tend to neglect any one training system, sort of energy system. So if you're building for an Ironman, you might still find that you're doing some threshold intervals. You might still find that some big gear, some 10-second intervals, etc. Just because you're going long doesn't mean we want to make you so specialized that you become a lot slower. So we do try to ensure completeness in the training. So I think there's room for all types of training, and we don't put all our eggs in one basket, really. We know that during the training and during the racing, we're going to be in discomfort. You know, we call it pain. We say we've got a pain cave. It's probably not that bad most of the time. It's discomfort that we're that we're sort of tolerating, and we need to build that ability to tolerate the discomfort for whatever the goal race distance is going to be. But we probably shouldn't go chasing it. If we expect the pain or the discomfort to be a 7 or an 8 out of 10, it doesn't need to be there within the first few minutes of a training session or within the first few minutes of your bike leg of your race. It wants to be there as an average by the time we get off the bike. So we don't necessarily want to go chasing the pain and the discomfort in the first few pedal strokes. So just embrace that suck and expect that it's going to hurt, but you've got to let it come to you a little bit. Don't go rushing after it. Remember, we've got to get through the leg first. We've got to get to the end of the bike as efficiently and as fast as we can, not just get through the first kilometer as hard as we can. And then the key thing that changes based on your goal race really is the specificity of the key sessions. So again, particularly if you've highlighted a couple of key races that are your major goals for a season, we will try to make your key sessions as specific to that race as possible. And Phil's going to mention this a bit more when we talk about planning for the course itself and prepping yourself for that bike leg. But the main considerations is, we spend a lot of time looking at numbers and chasing data. And we can obviously do that a bit more strictly if we're on the turbo trainer. We can hold an exact power. Whereas when we go outdoors, because of the nature of the terrain and the weather and the traffic islands and stoplights and things, we do get great difficulty in holding the power as strictly, or the heart rate. But there are so many benefits from riding outdoors. We're getting used to our race bike, we're getting used to the road surfaces, we're getting used to our TT position, et cetera, et cetera. So I think most of us would say that we'd rather see you doing your interval sessions and your long rides things outdoors, because that's specific to your race. You're not racing on a turbo. And even if the power is a little bit off, it's more likely that you've gained huge benefits from riding your bike in the real world that outweigh just being so specific with the power or the heart rate data from indoor training. And that's not for everybody if the weather's bad, and it's not all year round, but certainly for that key race specificity, that's really important. And then if we can take that even further and actually, know the course that we are aiming to ride, what is the road surface like? How many hills and sort of how steep are they? What are the gradients that are involved? If it's a local course, if you're targeting Ironman UK in Bolton, we can go out and ride the course and actually get some real world data and practice on it. But if not, if it's abroad, Phil will mention some ways that we can actually try to tackle that and try to prepare for the course, even though we might not have seen it firsthand. And then the other thing I think is a key failing point for a lot of people is you might target a power level. So you might say, I want to ride this bike leg at 200 watts, but you might not be able to deliver that in a smooth manner because it might not be a flat bypass sort of time trial course. It might involve, like Phil said at Swansea earlier, a hugely hilly course with lots of turns and twists. And therefore we need to prepare you, yes, to ride 200 watts average, but you're going to need to vary that intensity quite a lot on a course that's as demanding as that. And again, we need to look into that when we're preparing you for the race. And then the other factors obviously is, what are you like when you're climbing? What's your preferred climbing position? Which one, how much power can you get out when you're on the TT bars versus seated and on the base bars? And what's your cadence for climbing? What's your preferred cadence? And how do you get, the best speed out of the bike when you're climbing? And then descending, do you have a weakness in this area? Are you better? Practicing some descending skills for the control of the bike and that ability to tolerate higher speeds without panicking, perhaps improve your cornering technique. There's some, in that sense, there's some free speed to be had there if you feel that's a weakness of yours. And again, Phil will mention this a little bit later.
Yeah, good.
Right.
Thanks, Phil.
Hang on, not finished yet.
Sorry, mate.
There's a final bit was just say, so preparing for your goal race, that is what the key sessions are all about. If we think about just basically as energy zones, as the zones that we often talk about when we're bike training, if your key goal race is a sprint distance, it's likely that the power levels you'll be working on in your key sessions to prepare you for that 1 hour race, or roughly 1 hour, is upper aerobic level. So it's threshold training, it's maybe some VO2 max training. And for these sorts of races, going more for an intensity model will probably get you the results you need. You perhaps don't need to be spending huge amounts of times on duration of training to get some of those results. When we go to standard distance, and if we're talking about 2 to 3 hours as an approximate time scale for that, we're now again looking at your sustainable aerobic power and ability. So we're looking at threshold, we're looking around your critical swim speed, your CSS for swimming. And again, a lot of training might be in that tempo and sweet spot range. That's the kind of power levels that you're going to be achieving on the bike for that race distance. So that's where we need to spend some time. And then middle and long, obviously we're looking anything from 5 hours upwards, hugely. So we're looking at a lower aerobic training. So we do a lot of zone 2 type of training for this. We need to build that endurance, both aerobic, to do with the heart and lungs, and also to do with the muscular system, just being able to continue to turn the pedals for such lengthy periods of time. And that builds sort of so-called resilience in the muscles. And then we build that resistance to fatigue. So our FTP might not go up, but we might be able to hold a higher percentage of it for longer because we're not fatiguing so much. And then obviously the key thing is, yes, you might be able to achieve those sorts of bike sessions, but then, with the use of brick sessions, which become quite key in your build periods, we'll also see whether you can actually run at a decent pace off that level of bike intensity. And obviously that puts that final brick in the wall, as they sort of say, so that we're then ready for the race. And we know that we're not going to jeopardize your run by giving you too high of a target on the bike. Right, over to you, Phil.
Yeah, cheers, Phil. Evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about here, I'm going to use a bit of a live example to show you as well, is like course management and planning with the bike, which I think is like, after Phil's part 1, is like the main thing people were coming asking for is how to manage terrain. So obviously every course is different. Some are hilly, some are flat, some have short, steep hills, some have long, draggy hills, some are windy, some are hot, and I think that's like one of the big discussions leading into an A race or any race with athletes, is getting this right. And we normally start that discussion, I think, anything from 4 to 12 weeks out from the race. How can we start to put things in place so that you can, in training, replicate and know in your head how to handle race day, much more so than on the swim, unless it's an ocean swim and you're not comfortable with that. Generally the swim's the swim. Maybe it's non-wetsuit, we deal with that, but there's less variables. And I think on the bike, other than it being a hilly course or a hot course, it's either hilly, flat or hot, and you deal with those. On the bike, there's just so many factors, climate, humidity, the quality of the tarmac you're riding on, the size of the hills, even factors like, is the race at altitude? I think there's a lot of things, and they all affect your bike speed and how you should approach it. So can we in any way in your local area replicate any of these things? Well, yeah, we can, because we've got methods like training indoors to replicate maybe some heat, some course simulation on Zwift. You can create courses. I'll come on to that in a minute. You can go and ride some similar climbs on some similar quality roads, and also work on your bike setup. So, I'm riding on this road, different sessions with different tire pressures, so that you might read what the best tire pressure is, but you can go and play with this yourself. And a great example is, there's an optimal tire pressure for speed, but how long you're going to be out there, how you feel getting off a bike with 5 or 10 less PSI in your bike on a rougher, harder course might impact how you run. You can go and experiment with things like this. That's probably something not many people would think of doing. Your bike position, if it's a really hilly course and you're on a time trial bike, are the bullhorns really low? That makes climbing hard. Do we need to adapt position for that? Actually, on a really hilly course where aerodynamics plays into it less, can you afford a slightly higher stack position on the front? If you're on a road bike on a really hilly course, do you even need aero bars? Will you use them depending on your ability level? And then clothing and helmet choices as well. If it's really hot, you know, would you wear a vented road helmet over an aero helmet, visor on, visor off? You don't want to be leaving these decisions to race day. This is all stuff you should be thinking about in training. An example with the helmet would be, I remember an athlete trained, did all his time trial in an aero helmet, decided to ride a road helmet with his sunglasses on. The sunglasses he chose to use were the ones he was going to run in. As it happens, when he's in the TT position, he can't see past the rim. So he ends up riding with his head up all day because he can't see where he's going. Things like that you just want to bring into your training, just to give you that confidence. Well,
all right.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I think you know, there's lots of things that vary in how a course might be, but I think how hilly or flat a course is probably the number one thing that people think about when we're talking about course management, and it's the first thing that's in their head, maybe even when they're choosing a race. So Phil's already touched on this variability index, and this is to do with your power metrics, and I'm guessing that nearly everyone on here will be using power to race. When you do a big, long, steady state effort on Zwift on a flat course, you are going to have a variability index of 1, i.e. there is no variation. Your average power and your normalized power in your training peaks file will be the same as each other. The minute you start throwing hills in there, you start to get some deviation in the power. Normalized power is accounting for these hills. It even accounts for descents, cornering, etc. So it's sort of saying, whilst your average power might be varying up and down, especially on the descents, you might stop pedaling. Normalized power is accounting for this and sort of giving you a number that says this is a good average of what it takes to ride that course at that pace, effort level wise. You'll actually, you know, you're not actually accruing quite as much power on the way up a hard climb as you would with your average, but on the descent you're not losing as much as you would when it's zeroed. So if that makes sense about what normalized power is, variability index is your actual average power divided by your normalized power. Correct me if I'm wrong. No, sorry, it's your normalized power divided by your average power, actually. And it'll give you a number above 1. The further that number is above 1, the more you varied the power. So if you went and did a minute at max effort and a minute super easy for as long as you could, you'd have an enormous variability index. You definitely wouldn't want to ride a triathlon bike like that way. What we want to do is we generally want to minimize the variability index to as low as possible, because in triathlon, this really helps with the run and the sustainability of the effort over a longer period, because you're not smashing yourself up with the power spikes, whilst getting your bike over that course in the fastest possible way. So when you hit a slight rise going uphill, you have got to lift the power. If you just ride to this flat power level, you just slow down on the hills, and actually then you're pedaling a bit hard on the downhill when the speed is free. So the magic comes in, what is the variability index you're trying to aim for on different courses? The hillier it is, certainly a course like Swansea at the weekend with lots of short, sharp climbs early on, there's going to be lots of power spikes. People's variability, I actually haven't looked at the first 15 miles of anyone's file yet to see what the variability index was, but it will be very high, i.e. hardly pedaling downhill, having to go pretty hard uphill. What people should have done if they've listened to instruction is to go hard uphill, but not that hard that they're burning a match every time they do it, which Phil will come on to in a bit. You can't afford to do that. So you could, by replicating the course in the real world or creating something on Zwift, which I'll come on to, get an idea as to the variability index required to ride that course in the best possible manner. How do you keep the speed up to the highest on the hard parts of the course and let it drop below? And how much above and below do you want to go? In triathlon, I think a high variability index overall is about 1.2. Someone riding a good bike leg at Bolton this year, I think he rode the fastest bike leg actually, had a variability index of 1.15. and that's on a pretty hilly course. I think he managed that course. Oh no, 1.1 he had. That's incredible over such a hilly course. Most other athletes around him were about 1.2. So they were a bit spikier with the power. Funnily enough, the guy with the lowest variability index ran off the best as well. He probably had saved the legs a little. You can't really race to this metric. It's more about in training, experimenting with it, observing it afterwards, learning what feels right on certain climbs and how much to come off the power on the way down the climbs to create a variability index that you can run well off. So it's a very, very good reason to practice race specific type courses and run off as well, because it will give you an idea how you feel, to know on race day more by a feeling, or even just generally, I can go 30 watts over my target on most of these climbs, and I need to only go 30 watts under, or is it 50 watts and 50 watts under? And that will vary through the climb. That will vary through as the course changes. You might have steeper climbs at different powers. There's a tool called Best Bike Split. Some people may be aware of it. Certainly used it with quite a lot of athletes, and a lot of the coaches well, all the coaches I think are pretty versed on it. This is, I will show you at the end of this slide actually a live example of it. I'll keep it fairly simple, but it'll give you an idea as to how to pace a hilly course in real time based off an athlete's data. And off the back of that, I'll just quickly talk about how we can then create things for indoor training as well, especially at the time of year where you maybe can't, do the hard riding outside. And then the last part of this slide is like the technical aspects of course. And it surprises me how many people, and this is a real basic one, do not go and recon the course first. I've actually and it sounds extreme, but it's really helped performance. Like I can't tell you how much, flown to another country earlier in the year on a small training camp to where the big race was going to be later in the year to make sure I knew the mountain descents and stuff. And actually really helps on race day to the tune of not like a minute or two. I reckon in one example, I saved 8 or 9 minutes over other people from knowing a very big descent off a mountain. Of course, that's pretty extreme, but certainly racing in the UK, go in a day, or at least drive the course if you can, drive as much of the course as you can. If you can't do it all, just anything that helps, maybe try and look for a very technical part of the course and go and learn that. So an example would be a race, World Champs in 2019. There was quite a lot of TTT athletes there. I actually did a bit of data breakdown afterwards on a part of the course probably no one was thinking too much about. It's just a long straight road with about 6 or 7 roundabouts on it. The roundabouts are quite tight. I looked at the speed that I went through there versus all the other athletes. All the other athletes rode a lot more power than me through that section. I rode 30 seconds faster than them all. And my variability index was an awful lot lower because I'd reconned the roundabouts. I knew exactly how to brake for them. I didn't have to spike it out of the roundabout at all, thus saving my legs for later on. It's great that they can put all that power out and that we've got some really talented athletes power-wise, but my feedback to them was, imagine if they'd put that power out but smoothly. They'd have gone 30 seconds faster than me, a minute faster than themselves. So knowing the course and being quite savvy in that way, it really stacks up, and the more technical the course, the more it's really important to know it. Phil, if you can just share my screen. Let me share my screen. Typical, I can't see which one I'm meant to share now. Can you see that now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is, I just need to move people out of the way on that side, that's fine. This is a course profile, the blue line for Lanzarote 70.3, which is in March every year. And this is the current course they use. And this is actually just 1.5 laps of the course. But you can see the profile is pretty nasty. There's not a lot of flat, there's a lot of climbing. So this is a good one to use. This athlete data is based off someone riding a normalized power of 255 watts for the course. And covering this 55 kilometer section about 1 hour 32. what we're really looking to sort of learn from this is the ignoring the orange line, which is the speed, which is just the outcome of what we're doing here. I think the faded gray line in the background, as I hover over it, will give you an idea of what kind of power this athlete needs to push at certain parts of this course. So obviously we're on the hardest climb of the day to start with. And if you look at a few examples early on the climb, when it's not too steep, they're a little over their target 255 watts at 262. The climb steepens up. They're at 283. So the 30 watts over. And actually the top section gets very hard. And they're actually for a short period of time going 340 watts to keep the bike moving at the optimal speed on that climb. They go over the climb, and this is the bit I think that's obvious to everyone is, we're going to go over race power on the climbs, but by how much? And that's quite an extreme example. This is the bit I think where people make the mistake is there's a descent. This one was just fast, pretty straight road. 150 watts. I think in reality it's probably even lower because you're going so quick it's hard to even keep 100. But the idea is don't try and keep pedaling hard. There's no need to. You're going so quick. The speed at one point on this course is at 80 kilometers an hour. So we hit a longer, more draggy climb next. This blue line here, and actually if you look, this is a bit smoother how to climb it, but it's at race power or above the whole way up. So you imagine by the time we top out at the top of this climb, we've spent an awful lot of time above race power. So you don't then this is a gradual descent. You don't then try and go, oh no, my race power is 255. I'm going to keep holding it. You actually have to come right off the gas and you look at the target watts here. This is 190. 170 watts. For this athlete, this is endurance riding. It's dead easy. This is a time to refuel, get aero, go fast, but come right off the power because this is only one lap. You've got to do all that first section, which is very hard riding. You've got to do it all again in a minute. So really back off on the fast stuff. And I think these tools, you can use with a coach to just get I don't think you need to memorize the numbers. What you need to do is have an idea as to how above and below you need to go and practice it and then come back and feedback. It's quite, and this is another reason I believe time trialing is a really good tool in the UK. It helps you learn this. I've ridden a few lumpy-ish ones this year where you're trying to manage speed over bridges, over main roads. And, you do just get a feel for what kind of wattage I can push up to and then what I can back off to on the descent off the bridge, the other side or something, and keep that bike moving at the optimal speed is the key. It's not really about the power you ride. It's about how fast you get to the finish line. Very on an aside, you can also add weather data to this, like wind as well, live wind, especially as you get close to a race, and you can then come up with a power plan based off wind speed and direction as well as course profile. So it gets and it's remarkably accurate as well, actually, this.
Yeah. And you can do a small printout, can't you, of the rough power? I think it will print out just a very vague power outline for you, which you could even stick to the stem of your bike.
Cheat sheet.
Yeah.
So this is a nice little feature. Oh, it's not filled it in for some reason. But you can imagine on the power base side here, it will give you a little, when you're on a gradual hill, it'll tell you about what power. When you're on a major hill, about what power. One of my athletes had one of these stuck on his bike for Swansea or Sunday. It's just then you don't have to think. It's another thing to not think about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Phil, you can reshare.
Right. Okay. Okay, so just developing that. So we've talked about managing the course. So just summarizing the pacing from another perspective. You need to know your numbers. We've just talked about various power outputs, and that was obviously specific to one athlete. And then we need to think about your data and where that's come from. Obviously started off by putting in threshold with some question marks and some exclamation marks, because when we start to talk about what is possible and how hard you should be pushing, I think the first thing is, because we relate it to threshold quite most often we'll say you should be pushing this much percentage of threshold. We just need to be a little bit cautious about how you've measured it. If it's come from a 20-minute test, the standard 20-minute test, take 95%, there is a chance that that number is quite high. And therefore, when you look at the data and say, I should push 80%, and then in a race, you only come back at 76%, you could see that as failure. And again, me and Phil were talking about this before we started, and we're both really quite different in the way that we can produce and maintain power. So although I'll give you some ideas in a minute of what you should be able to hold, that's what's theoretically possible. That's what researchers have come up with from bundles of data. But what is much more important is what you have proven that you can push on the bike. So this might come from previous racing, and it might come from your key training sessions as well. So you've provided us with evidence to say, right, this was my 70.3 effort, or this was my standard distance effort. And it was after a swim as well. And that's what I could push. So I think it's important before we start aiming for numbers and then seeing it as a success or failure, we need to see what you've actually done in the past or can do. And that will inform our decision making and help you plan your race. Obviously, we need to acknowledge that there is an effect from the swim. If we've swum very, very hard, we'll use up quite a bit of our anaerobic energy reserves. If we've swum much more endurance, then perhaps we've been able to burn fat. Perhaps we've kept it very aerobic, and therefore we won't have quite as much of an impact. But there is some fatiguing effect of the swim, and that could be both physiological and also psychological, because we know a lot of people get kind of traumatized by what goes on in the swim with the washing machine effect and the sighting and the getting clobbered and just the general anxiety. So all of those things affect your perception of effort. So for whatever reason, when you get on the bike, you won't ride at your ultimate if you were fresh. So for everybody, there will be some effect of the swim. For some people, it will be very minimal, and for others, it will be a lot bigger. So again, when we see the figures in a moment, we do need to accept that some people will be more affected by the swim. And therefore, I won't go down this line any further, really, but just to say, this is why you need to practice your swim. This is why you perhaps need to spend more time in the pool or in the open water, is because you're going to get on the bike fresher. Even if you choose not to swim any quicker and you hate swimming, think of it as improving your bike leg. If you need that as a mantra to get you to the swimming pool, then by all means do it, because hopefully you'll ride a faster bike leg if you're fresher coming to the bike in the first place. As Phil said, most of the pacing strategies are minimizing the slow parts of the course. If you can add extra power and hold a good aero position to get you through the slow sections as quickly as possible, then ultimately you should get to the finish line a little quicker. So even if the average power for the race is the same, by adding extra and then backing off on the fast sections, it should be to your benefit. So if you think about the slow parts of a course, it's largely those long, slight drags uphill. It's obviously the real hilly parts of the course, and it's the headwind sections or cross headwind sections. Those are the bits that we'd plan for and plan to go above your aim of your sort of your goal average power. But then on the flip side, as Phil said, you need to then back off a little bit on the faster sections because of the way that aerodynamic drag works, which we mentioned in the previous talk. You have to put a hell of a lot of extra power to go from, say, 50 to 51 kilometers an hour, whereas to go from 20 to 21 kilometers an hour doesn't take anywhere near that same spike in power. So it's all about, managing the course. If you get to 30 odd mile an hour and you're tucked in nicely, maybe that's a time to just hold a good aero position and practice and get your fueling in, as Phil said, not to try to squeeze out an extra couple of watts, because it might not really make you go any faster. As we've said, what it's often refers to is burning matches. If you go above threshold, you've burnt a match. So you've got to decide, is it worth it, and when is it worth it? And I think we sort of agree that, if you've got a very short hill, like a small overpass over a motorway, or a small hill where you can see the top and it isn't really that far away, I would largely ignore your power meter and just ride it as quickly, try to maintain speed into it, and try to keep the speed. And that might be anything from sort of 30 to 60 seconds, depending on the hill, but it will get you over it as quickly as possible. And obviously it shouldn't be a full sprint, but it is really just irrespective of what the power meter shows. Let's keep that speed at all as much as we can. And then obviously if it's a much longer hill, we need to decide, do we just stay below threshold? We know that basically the concept of threshold means that once we go above it, our time is going to drastically reduce that we can hold it. Once we stay below it, we can theoretically hold that for a much, much sort of exponentially longer period of time. So most of the time we may raise the power, but we tend to stay below threshold. If we raise it above, there's probably a match burnt. So we just need to be cautious when we do that. And then don't trust any single metric in isolation. So what we try to teach very much is to be able to kind of triangulate the data that's coming into us. So we've got the internal metrics like your perceived effort and your heart rate. And then we've got the external metrics like pace and power that come from your watch or your computer and your pedals and stuff. But we can't really trust or value any of those higher than another. And we also need to expect that in the early parts of a race, our heart rate is going to lag. It won't be right up at your goal heart rate at the very beginning, but it will creep up there. So again, a bit like I said before, don't chase the numbers right at the beginning of your race. Maybe again, the caveat to that is if you're doing a sprint race, it is, up your maximal sort of aerobic intensity and your heart rate will soon be quite high. So you don't need to worry too much of that lag in a short distance race. But from anything from standard and above, where we're talking about a number of hours, that RPE, if you aim for a perceived exertion of about an 8 out of 10, then it doesn't need to be 8 in the first few minutes. It might even be a 6 or a 7, and it might be a 9 and a 10 at the finish. But if we were given an average number, you would probably describe it as an 8 at that point. So it doesn't mean, like Phil said, you don't chase these numbers for the sake of it. We've got to look at the average for the ride and how to use it appropriately. So as I mentioned, there are some guidelines out there. And again, you can find these in various places and they'll all be slightly different because it's various experts and based on various bits of research. And it depends what the athletes were able to do in that research. And this is one such one. I think the targets here are a little bit too high. Certainly they would be for me. I don't race at those sort of intensity levels. But again, we were just discussing this before. And, the half Ironman power for Phil is probably very close. For me, where it says 0.83 intensity factor up to a 0.87. So that's 83% of threshold to 87% of threshold, basically. In a middle distance, even when I'm riding well, it's 80 to 81 at best. And that's, again, I can't do anything on that day to change that. I wouldn't see that as a failure because it doesn't fit with those numbers. So these give you rough ideas of where you would sit. And obviously you can see sprint distance is kind of around threshold. Like we said before, that's the zone you would train at a lot in your key sessions. Olympic is probably just below threshold. So again, that's the sort of zone that your key sessions would fall into. Half Ironman is around that zone 3. It's that tempo area. And then Ironman and anything longer than that, if you're silly to do that, obviously is much more lower aerobic, as we mentioned before. So there are some rough guidelines which we could use as a background, particularly if you've not got much race experience, but we wouldn't hold you to account to these to say, you've done well or you've done badly just because of those data points. And the one that I really like for Ironman is this one by Joe Free, which basically works out your TSS, which is a training peaks metric, your training stress score. So what we're looking at down the left-hand side is your predicted time on the bike. Obviously, if you've ridden a course before, you'll have a very good idea of what it's like to take. Otherwise, it's a little bit of a guesswork. And then over the top of the chart, you've got your intensity factor. So that's, again, percentage of threshold that you're going to ride at. And if you then join the two lines up, it will give you a predicted training stress score. And obviously what they're saying with the different colors is if you're in the lighter colors, the light gray, maybe the darker gray, that's probably an optimal range for most people on most courses, and particularly if you've not done that many Ironman races. Once you've got some of your own data, and if you're a strong runner and proven track record of running well off a hard bike ride, maybe you might start to aim for something a little bit higher. You go into the yellows. But as soon as we get to the orange or anything that's amber or orange, then it's likely that you have overbiked. And yes, you might have a very good bike split, but it's likely that your TSS is too high and therefore you will fail on the run. Now, again, it's not totally factual. It fits for me very, very well. I know from previous races I've done, it does that works very well for me. But again, it's something that we can relate to. We can look at our data, and then we can take it from there and maybe discuss with the coach and things like that. Okay, that's my bit done.
Yeah, Cadence. I think I see a lot of similarities in what goes on with all our athletes here. I think most people don't come from proper cycling backgrounds. They get into triathlon as a triathlete, and they're learning to do all three at once. And I think Cadence on the bike is maybe just something that people aren't really thinking about, and they get into bad habits. So this first term, end of range, I've actually stolen this from an American coach that Chris used to work with actually years ago. End of range, we do loads of big gear work, 50 RPM, grinding it out for leg strength. I like to get athletes working at the other end of the cadence scale, even though they hate it. They all hate it. 95 to 100 RPM and putting some decent power out at those numbers. It's uncomfortable. The main reason we do it is it's nearly like, from a neurological standpoint, it just allows people to have this range of ability and then aid self-selection depending on the race and the power you need. I think one thing, Phil, you probably agree with me here, but one thing I certainly find is, having been a cyclist my entire life, I can just ride at whatever cadence the specific race I'm in requires. I don't really need to train it. But the one thing I do is keep a bit of end of range training in. So if your coach sets you some horribly high cadence work and you hate it, I even think some people ignore it. I actually get athletes to ride their endurance rides at in excess of 90 RPM, just to be a bit more fluid. It's not that I want them to always race like that. It's just to aid, both ends of the spectrum. Why we want to be able to do that is, I think most of us aren't pigeonholed as athletes. Yeah, we might sort of have a preferred race distance, but I think most people are mixing it up. And the shorter the race, the higher the power, therefore the higher the cadence you should use. And to explain this simply, if you need to ride at your threshold power in a sprint distance race, or harder than threshold power, so a very, very hard effort for 30 odd minutes, and you did that down at an incredibly low cadence, let's say you did it at 50 RPM, your legs would be so smashed up by the end of that half an hour, you are not going to run very well. So that's an extreme example. But even if you were riding at 70 RPM, trying to put that kind of power out, you are going to be destroying the muscles, and it's not going to aid your run. It's also not going to aid the ability to hold that power for a very long time, because actually most of that ability comes from the aerobic system, i.e. utilizing oxygen for energy, and it's not just actually like brute force through the muscles. So if you say in a sprint distance you need to operate, I would say safely at 90 RPM to put out your best possible power for the distance, and you need to train that. So like Phil discussed earlier, specific training sessions for riding the bike. Well, this is another, when you are doing a VO2 session, do it at a higher cadence. It will be more specific to your race. And the same goes at the other end of the scale. If you're training for an Ironman, in an Ironman, you're not putting the same amount of force through the pedals, you're just doing it for a lot longer. So you can roll a bigger gear without destroying the muscles as much. We need to be conditioned for that. So when you do your Ironman training, train at an appropriate cadence, do the big gear work. It'll give you this ability throughout all of these to tolerate rolling a bigger gear. I think don't slave to a certain RPM, as this next comment has just come up on screen. As you're managing the course, riding over tricky terrain, keeping the speed of your bike high, I always think about, actually, when I need to lift the power to keep the bike high on a slight rise or a slight climb, I actually, instead of not bothering changing gears and just grinding it out, I actually knock it down a gear as the climb starts, for example, and I keep the cadence where I want it, or even slightly higher. So I might go, actually, I need to ride at something more akin to my sprint or Olympic distance power for this little section. So I will use a sprint or Olympic distance RPM for that section as well. Whereas then when I crest that climb and drop down the other side, I may go I might be putting out more like an Ironman power. I may go to an Ironman cadence, lowers the heart rate, and just roll it along. Crank length and your bike position as well are going to come into your ability to change cadence or use this end of range. I think most people can grind out a low gear. It's the high cadence they struggle with. If the bike position isn't optimal, and a lot of that comes from the hip angle being optimally rotated, as well as the angle not being too tight. So if you really struggle with high RPM work, and you find yourself doing sprint distance races at lower RPM, grinding it out, are you on an optimal crank length? Is your bike position sorted? A shorter crank length may well let you operate at a higher cadence better. Well,
okay, yeah, moving on. Obviously, again, remember, guys, if you've got questions, we'll come back to them at the end, no problem at all. So I wanted to frame this bit about, controlling what data you're actually paying attention to. You've got a limited attention. You can't be keeping abreast of absolutely single metric that your Garmin or your Wahoo can give to you, but there are some key ones that you should probably be keeping an eye on. But it's much like, when you're following your social media feeds on a daily basis, and you've got somebody that really pisses you off on a daily basis. Every time you see the posts or every time you see the comments, it just winds you up. And yet you don't really go to the effort of deleting them or blocking them or hiding them. If it's not, adding joy to your life, is there any real point in keeping an eye on what they're doing on social media? And that's obviously like a kind of current example. I think I come across a few people on my feeds that I should just get rid of, and perhaps will do. But anyway.
I do.
Yeah, I think we all do. But again, if that affects us negatively, we need to sort of pay attention to the fact that we can change that. We can control what comes into our headspace, and it's our headspace, and we should look after it. So from that point of view, this is kind of a bit deep for just looking at your Garmin, I suppose. But you can control what you see, and what you see can affect your effort either positively or negatively. So think about what's on your data screens. One night while you're watching the telly, get your Garmin out and maybe change some of your activity profiles so that they suit your personality, your goals for a given race. So we obviously, as coaches, we often try to get athletes to focus on process goals rather than outcomes that they can't control. Given certain weather conditions and certain other athletes racing, you can't necessarily say, I'm going to come top 5 or I'm going to beat 3 hours for this race or whatever the goal is, because the conditions might play against you, and you might have your best race and come 6th. So it's very difficult to focus on an outcome. Although we could have that as a lofty outcome goal, that's absolutely fine. But we need to focus on the process, so we can use the computer to help us with this. So the first thing that I want you to think about is, what can you display on your screen that you can control? And obviously I've listed some, I might not have listed everything, but some of the things that I have on my data screen is power. Obviously I can control how hard I'm pedaling. So a 10-second average is a nice average. Anything less than that, it tends to be too variable. So I don't tend to show that. And normalized power, again, as Phil said, this is an average power, but it takes into account all the variability in your ride. So normalized power is better to display on your computer than average, because it's more representative of what that ride feels like to you on that day, whereas average is often a bit lower, especially for hilly courses. So display the power if it will affect how you ride. And if it will help you in a longer distance race, perhaps control your effort level and not go too hard. In a short distance race, it might give you the kick up the backside to push on a little bit, because you can hold that power. Heart rate, obviously, again, you might have your current heart rate and you might have your average heart rate for the race, because you can ease up if you want to. If things look way too high and they feel way too hard, then maybe you need to back off a little bit. So that's, again, it can change what you decide to do in the race. Cadence, again, as Phil has just mentioned, we need to shut up. We need to pay attention to cadence, particularly if you're just not, keen on cycling, haven't spent a lot of time cycling. It might be that you always grind, but you've tried to practice keeping higher cadence, but you just keep falling back into the same routine. So it'd be quite nice to keep an eye on your cadence so that you can alter it really, and you can use that as a prompt. And you could obviously set an alarm, or you could use the lap timer on your Garmin to actually remind you when to do something, and it could be eating or drinking, as would be an obvious one. So those are things that would help us keep in the process and alter our effort level. The other thing is what would change our decision making at the time. So you might want to have your speed on there, and I'll mention that again in a minute, but we know that aerodynamics play less of a part in your speed when the road goes uphill and the speed drops. So you might prefer to sit up on the base bar and get more power out at a certain speed. Generally, it's sort of below about 12 or 13 miles an hour. That becomes probably more effective to actually just get the power down. And again, the gradient, you might find you climb very well and comfortably up to about a 5% gradient in the aero bars, but anything after that, you start to lose the power and you're not climbing so well. It doesn't feel comfortable. So maybe if you had the gradient on there, you could adjust it and go, okay, yeah, it is 8% now. I'm going to get up on the pedals and I'm going to really push it out now. And again, that would help with your pacing. Like Phil said before, on the steeper inclines, we need to be going above average power. And if it says there it's 8% or 10%, you know you've got to be cracking on. That's part of your pacing profile, really. And then if something really motivates you, if you're doing perhaps a shorter distance race and it's your average speed that you really want to keep up, then display it. You know, that's absolutely fine. The cautionary note for these sorts of things, displaying your speed and your time or your distance, particularly for the longer distance races, is you can't have ultimate control on those. If you end up in a pace line, you might have to accept the speed that you're going. If you end up, struggling along into a headwind and the speed's low, well, if you keep focusing on it, it's not going to put you in a very mentally, sort of good place for the rest of that ride. It's not going to help you with your motivation. Showing the time or distance, it might help you to chunk the race up and say, right, another 10 miles is done, another 20 minutes is done, etc. And that can help. But otherwise, you can't change time and you can't make the distance go any quicker. You are doing what you're supposed to be doing. So be cautious about displaying those. Obviously, you can put them on a secondary screen. So if you want to flick across on your Garmin, you can do, but at least you've got to make the effort to do that, which I think is quite useful. And then sometimes I think it's useful to ignore the data. In shorter distance racing, like a sprint distance, you almost feel like you are going as hard as you can, irrespective of what the data is telling you, whether your heart rate is in a certain zone, whether your power is at a certain level. Ultimately, in those shorter races, you feel like you're giving it everything, and that's all you can do. When we get close to the finish, maybe when we're within a few percent of our finish line, maybe then we don't really want to pay attention to the data. We're just thinking, I want to get to the finish as fast as possible. And if you've paced it a little bit slowly or a bit easily, you'll up the pace. If you're just trying to hang on, you are just trying to hang on. And it doesn't really matter what the data says at that point. And then that brings me on to this concept really, is that although we use the metrics, ultimately it's your perceived effort versus your estimate of how long is left that will govern how hard you are willing to work. So this is massively important. This is why we need to prioritize our feelings, our perception of exertion above a lot of the metrics that we have. If you are racing at 10 out of 10 effort with 3 hours still to go, it's only going to go one way. You're going to go slower. You'll have to. You can't maintain 10 out of 10 for another 3 hours. If you're at 10 out of 10 with 5 minutes left to go, you might even crack on and try to go harder. So at 10 out of 10 doesn't mean you couldn't go harder. But if you're judging your distance left or time left and you think, no, that's still quite a long way, you'll have to make adjustments. And ultimately, that is a bigger factor than any of the metrics in isolation. If you decide to race tactically, if you're in a pace line, or if you're in a draft legal race, a shorter distance draft legal race, you might not be paying so much attention to your power or your heart rate at that point because you're thinking more tactically. So again, that might be a time to just ignore the data if you think you have to play this tactical game. And then obviously for people who have a very well-established sense of a feel and perception of effort, you might trust that much more than you trust the metrics coming from your computer, these external metrics like pace and power. Okay, over to you, Phil, again.
Yeah, so pace lines and drafting, obviously, as the first one is going to say, Phil.
Sorry, mate.
don't cheat. So we're obviously talking about people riding at legal distance from each other. Most triathlons are 10-meter draft zone. So the distance from the front wheel of the guy in front to your front wheel. So it's actually about 8.5 meters between your front wheel and their back wheel. And why this is becoming a more relevant conversation in age group racing now. I think it's something we've all been aware of for quite a lot of years. If you can swim well and make a good pack, is the way we sort of term it, you could get with a few decent riders on the bike, and without breaking any rules, you ride in a line behind each other at the legal distance, and the guy on the front is having to work harder than the rest of you, and you might start to take turns being that guy on the front if you're all a strong group to ride away from the rest of the field, or chase down a lead group or something like that. I think it is important to say, I see so much cheating going on. It's unbelievable. And I just think you've got to race, so you can stand there honestly and say, I did that bike leg on my own and within the rules. Sitting too close to others is cheating. Using a big long pace line. If you have 20 guys ahead of you, you're the 20th guy and you're all sat at legal limit, I can tell you now, you're not going to need to put much power out to stay there on a flat course. It's pretty easy to sit there. It's within the rules. It's part of racing, good on you for being a good enough swimmer to get with the good athletes. And it's another reason to really work on your swim. And it will save your legs for the run. And I think in age group racing, there are scenarios where this is an important tactic. I would say that if at 30 meters they can measure the advantage that you're going to pick up from a guy in front of you, then these 10 meters in triathlon, and I probably am someone that would say it's not enough. I think the 20-meter rule they're starting to bring in some of these PTO events or challenge events is a good rule. But in an age group field with too many people on the road, it's not going to happen. You can play this situation to your advantage. This is a talk tonight about riding the course as fast as possible. So to not bring this up would be daft, because a lot of you will have seen, like, Nick Rose went really well at the weekend, and in a little bit of conversation I've picked up from him, he was 3 minutes away from breaking 9 hours from an Ironman. And in an ideal scenario, he would have got with a pace line for some of the bike leg. And I don't think that materialized for him very well in this particular race, just where he's come out the swim and he was isolated for a lot of it. And it probably was the difference between breaking 9 and not. And it is a tool you can use. You just need to judge those around you. Are they riding strong? Can I sit in and save some energy and fuel here? And then maybe I'll go past and they'll stay with me. And it would be wrong to say that you don't have, you have conversations with those you're with in the pace line. As you overtake them, you will say, I'll do a turn for a couple of minutes, then you come back through, or let's get working together and, share the workload. This is what goes on in the sport because it's well within the rules. And I think when you see some astonishingly fast bike splits in pro or age group racing, there's probably a lot of this going on. So at any level, just think about sitting at the legal limit, then moving up. If there's a group ahead of you on the road and you're a bit tired from catching up after the swim, wait behind the others, and then accelerate, get to that next group, and then sit at the legal limit for them and recover if the effort's been big. There's many ways to use a pace line. You can jump from one group to another. And then in the same respect, definitely been in many situations where you're the strongest in the group and you've got 2 or 3 guys sat at the legal limit behind you, but they can stay with you because it's so much easier sat back there. Don't carry dead weight with you. I would actually attack them like in a road race. If I catch the guy I've been chasing down for a while, I generally don't just cruise up to the back of him and sit on. I will go past him really, really hard so he can't get on. And he'll have a moment where he'll go, oh God, I can't go with that. And the minute that gap's gone, he won't come with you. And you're riding on your own and you're opening that gap all the way to T2. So it's probably something we've never really discussed on one of these talks, but I think it's actually something to be very aware of as your bike skills develop. This is something that the top age groupers are doing. I had a good example at British Champs last year where I think the guy who ended up beating me that day was with me, and he wouldn't have responded to the faster rider coming through that I did respond to. And I got on the back of a very good pace line that day. And only because I'd done it did he do it. Had he not seen me do that, he'd have fallen a lot further back. And on the run, well, we wouldn't have been running together and he wouldn't have picked me for second place. So, you know, he will have gone away from that going, oh, bloody hell, yeah, I need to be more switched on to these pace lines because that saved me a lot of time on that bike leg. So be aware you can do it. And yeah. And then the last thing is don't, you know, I've said don't cheat, but don't get, when you're doing these things, it's quite easy to get done for drafting because you drift into the draft zone of the person in front. And when you do that, you should make the pass. The minute you're within this 10-meter zone, the rules are you must continue through and make the pass. Then they have to drop back from you. The problem with that is you're in a pace line of 10 people and you're coming along a fast section and you hit a steep climb. It concertinas up, or a corner. It concertinas together. And what you do is you don't want to go through because you don't want to be the guy on the front at that moment in time. So you go within about 6 meters and then back yourself off back to 10 meters as it spreads back out. If you've been clocked by an official in that period, that concertina effect of the group, you get penalized. So if you do end up rolling up to someone, you've got to make that move through. But I think it's more about being aware of the course. Is there a climb coming? Is there a corner coming? Just don't allow that to happen. And it does mean you have to slow up a little bit more than you want to. But I think the overall effect of using the pace line is greater than what you'd lose.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Yeah. Okay, so last sort of thing, I'm not going to go into detail into nutrition again. That's not the point here, but just some of the considerations that would help you to ride a fast bike split. So the first thing, just as a concept to sort of be aware of, is that within your body, mainly as muscle glycogen, you've got a certain amount of carbohydrate that you can use. And for most of us, if we're fully stored, so we're not trained that much and we've ate really well, then we could have enough within us to last about 2 hours of us working really quite hard. Now, it can be less than that and it can be a little bit more than that, but that gives you a rough idea. Now, if we've been training hard and we've not been eating well, it certainly won't be that much. That's called endogenous because that's within your body. That's the carbohydrate stored. It's in the liver and the blood as well, but it's mainly in the muscle. And then we've got exogenous, which is what you take in while you're racing. And that's obviously in your diet. So if we maintain that during the race, it will help us to spare those energy reserves that are in the muscle. So by us taking on an energy gel or some powder in a drink or some real food, the glucose in that and the sugars in that will help to spare some of the glycogen in our muscles, and therefore we should be able to keep exercising at a high level for longer without exhausting our glycogen supplies in the muscle. So that's kind of the background of why we need to think about these things. And that means that we do need to prioritize carbohydrates over things like protein, fat, and vitamins and nutrients. It's not about a healthy diet. It's about, are we getting the sugar in the carbohydrate? And for most of us, it's simple sugars. It's glucose, fructose, and the like. So we need a plan. And I'll talk briefly about what that plan might be, but we need a plan and we need to practice that plan. Not only do we need to, spend a little bit of money now and again, actually using the supplements that we're going to race with. And I wouldn't do it in every single session that we do. But again, in some of those key sessions, which are at your race intensity, you need to see if you can stomach those products. And even if you can swallow them, it's about practicing again with specificity for your race. So have a plan and practice it, and don't just practice it now and again, practice it, maybe once a week and at your race intensity. The other thing, particularly for the middle and longer distance races, is how much of that can you actually store? You might decide you need so many grams of carbohydrate and so much fluid, but how much of that are you going to put on your bike? Or are you going to use aid stations? And then what's on supply at the aid stations, etc. So we need to think about storage solutions on the bike. And as I said in the first talk, the other issue with storage is it should allow us to eat and drink without breaking the aero position if possible. So if you've got the front bottle with the straw, and you don't have to lift your head up, you don't have to sit up on the base bars, then all well and good. So storage needs to be plentiful for middle and long distance, but it also needs to be accessible, ideally from the tri bars would be ideal. We can set reminders on the watch or Garmin computer, as we said, to remind us to eat and drink at certain intervals if that's part of the plan. And just remember that really we want to stay on top of this on the bike. We'll already come into this with a slight deficit from the swim, depending on the length of the swim. That could be a tiny deficit or quite a big deficit. You know, if we're swimming an hour and 40 for an Ironman swim, that's a long time to be exercising without any nutrition. So again, we need to bear that in mind. So when we get on the bike, you know, it's like, I think Bob Babbitt calls it a rolling buffet. We've literally got access to all this food and drink if we want it, and you should make the most of it. Generally speaking, our abdomen isn't moving around too much. Our breathing is a little bit more controlled than when we're running. So we really need to aim to get off that bike in as well hydrated and sort of well-fed state as we can before we get onto the run. So the basics are that our carbohydrate requirement really remains constant. If we're racing an Olympic distance at a certain intensity level, we're likely to need a certain amount of carbohydrates in our sports nutrition. If we do an Ironman distance in so many hours, whatever, then it's going to stay the same. Hydration will change depending on sweat rate, and sweat rate obviously is dependent on the heat and the humidity. So we need to keep carbohydrate sort of intake fairly constant based on our race intensity and race distance, but hydration will probably fluctuate. So we need quite a fluctuating nutrition and hydration plan based on the goal race. So some races we might want more of our calories in liquid form because we know we're going to be drinking a lot more. At other races we might think, I'm not going to drink because it's going to be cold, I'm probably not going to get through a full bottle. But your carbohydrates are still needed. So you might decide to take a couple of extra gels and go lighter on the fluids. And again, this could be varied from race to race. So briefly, as the last thing we're going to mention is, if you're doing a sprint distance, what you eat before is much more important. If your muscle glycogen is well stocked, then you won't run out of glycogen, even if you didn't touch anything within an hour to an hour and a half of that sprint distance race. It is proven that a mouth rinse can help. So you've got sensors in your mouth that sense sugar. So if you put anything sugary in your mouth, and even if you can't stomach it, these sensors will release more of your muscle glycogen from inside of your stores to help you exercise harder. So even if you spat that out, that's quite a famous study a few years ago now. But so again, even if you can't stomach it, you're worried about digestive issues, or you just can't get your breath, even just swilling some sugary water around your mouth would give you a bit of a boost. When we go up in distances, obviously nutrition during the race becomes a bit more important. And when we get into standard distance there, I think we probably need to still prioritize the intake through fluids and gels, things that are much easier and quicker to digest than our stomach, because we're exercising at that higher intensity level. And maybe we only aim for some of the lower intake levels at maybe 60 grams. These figures that I'm giving here are not set in stone, they're just examples. So maybe we go for sort of 50, 60 grams an hour, and that would be plenty in a standard distance race. When we go to middle, again, what we do during that race is essential. We're going to be out there a lot longer, so maybe we want to just try and aim for a higher intake. So we might be looking in the region of 60 to 90. And again, because we're exercising at a slightly lower level, maybe we decide then to take some more solid type foods on, which will take a little bit longer in the stomach to digest. They will release the sugars perhaps a little bit slower, but we'll still get used to them within the duration of that race. And it's likely that the blood flow to our gut isn't quite as impaired as it is at those sort of threshold race intensities, which we've just talked about. So again, if we keep things nice and fluid and passing through the gut quickly, even if it's not got a great blood supply because all the blood's in our working muscles, then we should still be able to digest it quite well. As the intensity level comes down and as we go out to long distance, again, we might try to squeeze in a few more grams of carbs per hour, because we know that nutrition is massively, massively important in long distance. And we might decide to go over to some real foods even, and energy bars, which will take longer to digest. They're a little bit harder on the digestive system, but that system still has more blood flow in most cases because we're not working at those intensity levels. So those are just some of the basics, I would say, of how to plan your nutrition around your goal race distance. And then just briefly, just to mention caffeine, again, we could always chat about this on another sort of call or later on if you've got a question. But if you're taking caffeine in, remember that it's got about an hour for it to have its maximum effect. Now, that means if you're doing a sprint distance, you probably want that caffeine gel, the coffee, the Pro Plus tablets, whatever you're deciding to take. You want them before the race if you're going to utilize caffeine within that race. It's got about a five hour or so half-life. That means if it gets to a certain level within your blood and within your body, it will take about 5 hours for your body to metabolize it to about half the strength. So when you're doing longer races, when you're doing races over a couple of hours, so going middle and long, you probably need to think about micro dosing the caffeine or taking multiple doses of caffeine throughout that race within every few hours. So you might alternate gels, or you might alternate products, or you might have one caffeine gel every 2 hours, you know, these sorts of things. If you want to work out exactly how much to take, the recommendations for a performance enhancing effect are between 3 and 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. Obviously start at the low end. If you've not used it very often, or you know that you're a bit sensitive to caffeine, definitely start down at the 3 milligrams per kilogram and don't go up the top end. It's very rare that people have bad effects from caffeine, but people do have sensitivity. So you don't want to be whacking this in massively and just seeing what happens, because you could feel awful. And it can affect digestion as well. So start low and practice it in training again. So to finish, have a read of that yourself, basically. But we've talked a lot about some concepts. It's not that important that you understand them all. These webinars will be on YouTube for you to come back to. Hopefully it's given you an overview, which will help you understand things more. It might help you ask more questions of your coach and have better dialogue with them and prompt them to give you some advice, and that's great. And again, if you've got specific questions, just come to us with those specifics. And then, as I don't know where I heard this, but you know, if you say knowledge is power and power is speed, that's what we're all about. So that's why we've gone down the webinar sort of education series over this last couple of months. So yeah, that's us done. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'll stop the screen share, but if you've got any questions, either come off mute if you want to, or we'll go through the chat.
Yeah, the question there already about if you're not using power, what's the best way to pace it? And yeah, I think RPE is always the best way. Especially like what you've got to be careful of is immediately out the swim, RPE is a bit skewed. If you know you've just got out the swim, but also you haven't just put 20, 40, 60 miles worth of effort in the legs. The legs feel pretty good. So you can go a bit too hard. And actually, experience will help you gauge that. But I would say, if anything, for most people, it's not as hard as you think straight away. You might like start even an Olympic distance bike leg. I think for a lot of people, you know, RPE at 6 or 7, 5 or 10 minutes in, that's going to feel much more like an 8. And then, you know, if it doesn't start feeling like a 9, you can start pushing it to a 9. So RPE is key. I think you can then bring heart rate in as a metric once you've recovered from the swim a bit and you've settled down. I certainly think the longer the distance, the more heart rate is something you can use, especially if the temperature is different to normal. You sort of know what heart rate you've been doing in training for your Ironman efforts or your half Ironman efforts. I think for Phil's already said it tonight, for sprint distance racing, it's nearly less. I mean, I did my last sprint distance race. I never wore a watch at any point during the race. There's just no point. I just asked myself in the swim, can I swim 750 meters at this pace? And I kept asking myself that. And on the bike, I started pushing and thought, I've got about half an hour riding here. I broke it down into 5-minute slots in my head. And every 5 minutes, I'm saying, can you do another 5 minutes at this pace? Can you do another, you know? And then on the run, it's kilometer by kilometer. So it's RPE for sure. Is even though I have that data available, definitely RPE is still king, I think. And I think the more experienced you are, the more you can rely on it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we don't expect to get it right the first time, and it's okay to not get things right. And then, you know, if we're using other races and training experiences to help you with your goal race, then it's all, you know, it's all going to be beneficial. So yeah, don't worry about getting it wrong. We'll try to make that, you know, less of a chance of happening, but it may well do, and you'll learn from it.
Yeah.
So Jen's asked, with long, slow drags, is there an optimal cadence to aim for? Or is this just down to experiment how best you hold the power best? Yeah, I think as Phil said, it depends how that long, slow drag fits within the context of the whole race, how many of those long, slow drags there are, and also your preferred cadence range. The one thing we haven't quite mentioned is that if you change cadence on race day, you will feel a higher perception of effort if it's not where you have practiced and where you traditionally hold your power. So if we said, yeah, you need to ride this hill at 75 RPM, but you naturally sit well away from that, when you do it on race day, that will feel way harder than it should do. And that's what Phil was saying earlier on. If we train with a variability in cadence, do different sessions at both high and low and moderate cadence, we'll have better adaptability on the day. So if we do say, yeah, you go at this cadence, then you'll be able to, and it won't feel out of the ordinary. So your perception will match what you're actually doing. Again, as Phil said, I think if it's a long, slow drag, we're talking about, like Phil said, keep on top of the gear and keep the legs spinning. So you don't want to be getting slower and slower as the hill goes on. And that might mean changing gear. So I think, yeah, don't end up down at a slow grind. You want to keep on top of the pedals so that you're not using all those fast twitch muscles in your legs and sort of burning them out. But that doesn't mean speed up massively. I think
the only thing I'd add is go and ride the same hill twice, once at 70 RPM and once at 90 RPM, or maybe not even that extreme, once at 80 and once at 87, and get a feel for what's right for you, for that type of gradient. And you just think, years of doing those kinds of things, you start to just default to, on this kind of gradient hill at this kind of power, I know that for me this is about the best cadence. I would probably even say that's an RPE thing. I don't actually know what that cadence is. I know what it feels like to optimize power and cadence, and it's a feeling, and that's what you're probably striving towards in the end.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a question? Feel free to ask them in person now that we've finished the talking. You don't have to text them in. It's up to you.
I think like you said as well, I think people that are listening to this afterwards or tonight do, this is just about putting ideas in your head that we've discovered over many years of doing this, and it's like, go on your own journey of discovery and try some of these things. Try a short distance time trial at your local time trial at 10 RPM higher than normal, and actually just see what works and what's different. I think it's more, we're just trying to open people's eyes to thoughts, and those thoughts for most people make sense and therefore it works for them. None of this is rocket science, really. So
I'll just ask you, I think, to finish then, maybe if nobody else has a question about best bike split. How much functionality can you get if you don't pay for it? Is there a free version, and then, or do we really need this sort of subscription version?
Yeah, it's pretty limited for free. You can have one or two races, I think, that you can get. Or Best Bike Split has the files for nearly everything in there that you want. Races, local time trials, it's just all there. You just pull the file in, or you can upload GPX. The free version, you get one or two. Might be all right if you've just got a major A race and you just want to have a look at the data. The advantage to the paid version, which, it's not super cheap, but I do use it as a business tool. It's about $19 a month, I think. I probably will stop that subscription in the winter when I don't need it as much. But it's live weather data, all the courses. You can sort of like send the files to the athlete. You can break the course down into as many segments as you want. Helps you create Zwift workouts based off it for course specificity. I think more than anything with an athlete, I don't think the athlete has to have full understanding of Best Bike Split. It's nearly about floating the idea of managing the terrain and always selling that idea over your power for the day is 255 watts, which is a very, very basic way of doing it to anyone, isn't it? I mean, it's actually nearly In fact, I'm never going to say that to anyone ever again, because actually an absolute, without adding in all of this other context to it, that's a ridiculous sentence to give to anyone. Here's your race power. It's how you manage it over the terrain. So yeah. There is another tool out there which you'd reminded me of the other day, actually, Phil. My Wind Sock.
Yeah.
Gives you an idea based, and that is a free tool, isn't it?
No, again, it's the same. It's got a basic free version and then a subscription version.
That tells you basically about like how hard to push and not push into the wind, and where the wind will be, headwind, tailwind. And I think even that people aren't thinking about it. You know, it's one of the first things I want to know the day before the race is what's the wind direction for the next day. And that
was sort of produced by a young local time trialist to Cheshire called Ben Norbury. He's often on the Manchester course races. So it's nice again to give him a few quid and help him, develop these products as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's clever stuff what they do. So
I have a personal question. If nobody wants to ask a generic question.
Yeah.
Experience. I mean, I'm doing very little races, just the occasional Ironman and things. In reality, we don't really train that kind of distance normally. But the last experience was at the run, halfway through the run, and feeling, all right. Suddenly, there's just a sudden phase that gone through the body, gone cold and shut down. Question is, what is the common cause for that? And then is that because of electrolyte imbalance, or glycogen's depleted? If so, then if it's electrolyte related, then how much would a kind of customized hydration kind of a package individually customized? What do you think? How much it would help?
Well,
yeah, the answer to that, unfortunately, is it depends. It's multifactorial. What's going on within your body. Let's say that was 10 hours or 9 hours into an Ironman race. It could be a plethora of different things causing that fatigue that you're feeling. Training is one part of it. And I know you said we can't fully mimic race day, but as part of the training, a lot of us coaches would give an athlete, at least a 5-hour bike ride or even a 6-hour bike ride, occasionally an hour's run off the back of that bike ride as training. So whilst we're not doing it week after week, we do need to prepare that athlete for both the mental and physical aspects of Ironman. And unfortunately, if they've chosen to do that, that means they've got to try to find the time to do that training. And part of that is just not having a rest. It's about keeping going. So training is definitely one aspect of it that maybe that would help you. I think you've always got to go for the carbohydrates and the glycogen before you go to electrolytes and hydration. That they might be issues, but again, if you look at a hierarchy of things to look at, you need to look at your nutrition strategy versus your calorie expenditure. And what I was just saying is, if you were below 60 grams an hour when you look back, you're definitely going to fail. You're never going to get through that whole race because you're racing on fumes. You've got nothing left. So fatigue and the bonk or hitting the wall or whatever you want to call it, that's going to come. So again, it's analyzing that, and then it's going back to training and actually trying to up the carbohydrate intake at race intensity over longer durations and see if that helps. But as you say, when we come to Ironman, it is so extreme that there are often a few unknowns. We would never get anybody to ride 100 miles and run 20 or 26 off the back of it, because that's a race. That's not a training session anymore. That's such a big impact and toll on the body. But if you can learn from race to race, so if this has happened to you and you've got a log or you've got an idea of what was part of your nutrition strategy on that day, you could now look back at it and go, well, how many grams of carbs do I think I actually got? And if you don't know, then again, that's the place to start, is to work out a plan and then try it in training. And then, yes, as a final thought, you might then look at hydration. You might then look at electrolyte balance. But I definitely feel that the training and the nutrition come way above that in my hierarchy of what to go for first.
Yeah, I think
glycogen, in the hierarchy, glycogen weighs more than electrolytes.
Yeah.
In that situation.
Yeah. You need to be sparing as much of yours as you can. So in training, if you improve your fitness levels, your aerobic fitness, then you will hopefully burn more fat as fuel as you're exercising at your set Ironman level. And you've got, enough fat in your body to fuel you for weeks, never mind hours. You've got, even a skinny person has so much fat, they could exercise for days and weeks without eating. But the intensity would have to be very low. So we therefore need carbohydrate because that will be broken down a little bit quicker than the fat. But you've only got so much. And as I say, you will go through that in about 2 hours, but you could still have 10 hours left in your race. So what we need to make sure is that your intake is sufficient. And you will never, it's very, very difficult to match your output. We're not looking at balancing a scale, but we want you to cross the finish line at the moment you're fully depleted. That's kind of the aim, is to get you to the 26.2 miles at the point that you use your last little molecule of glucose. And that would be perfect. Apart from you might be in the medical tent, but yeah, that would be perfect.
I think it also goes back to what you were talking about earlier about more like how hard can you push on the bike. Now you can go, I can push physiologically, I can push 75% of my threshold and cope with that on the bike. But if anecdotally you're falling apart on the run when you do that, then actually you can't push 75%, because at the higher the power you push on the bike, the more carbohydrate you're burning through. If you're not fat adapted enough and you are running out of glycogen, you probably have to then try 70% on the bike and see how you run. And I think it's about changing, like Phil said, there is a hierarchy. Make sure you've got the big hard training sessions done. Up your glycogen levels to, as a ballpark figure to start with, 90 grams of carbs per hour. Then look at how hard you're actually doing the bike leg. And from there, you'll narrow it down. If you've still got issues from that, it's either about riding your bike easier, becoming more fat adapted, or then starting to look at things like hydration and stuff like that. So, but yeah, I totally agree with that hierarchy. From an electrolyte point of view, which I think is why you asked the question, whilst experimenting with glycogen and the training, take some electrolytes. Pretty simple, I think as long as you're taking some electrolytes through an Ironman, especially on a hot day, it's just generally safe practice. This might be 500 milligrams an hour, 700 milligrams an hour or something. Your body will self-regulate it a bit, and unless you then decide later on you've got a specific electrolyte problem or a very high sweat rate, and then you can take that further.
Yeah.
Okay, last chance. Anybody else got a question, or should we wrap up?
Yeah, I think we'll
wrap
up there. We've been on 80 odd minutes. So thanks, mate. And thanks for everyone for attending. Nice sunny evening. We're quite pleased with the numbers that were on there. So everyone could have been out sunbathing still tonight, I think. Right. Cheers for attending. Bye, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.